Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you heartfelt tales that inspire, heal, and touch the soul. Today, we share the moving story of Robert Miller, a widower who thought his best days were behind him. Burdened by guilt and loneliness, he believed he was a shadow in his family's busy lives. But a surprise trip with his son Andrew would change everything, leading to a heartwarming revelation about love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family. Join us as we uncover this unforgettable journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's tale of hope and renewal. Robert Miller sat in his small room in Dallas, Texas, gazing out the window at the streets below. The world outside buzzed with life, but inside, everything felt still, heavy, and hollow. At 72, he found himself in the most unfamiliar place of all, reliant on others. For a man who had prided himself on independence his whole life, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Robert's son Andrew and his daughter-in-law Maria had graciously offered him a place in their home after a fire destroyed his house in Charlotte. Despite their kindness, Robert felt like a misplaced artifact in their lives. The room he stayed in had once belonged to his grandson, a reminder of how much had been rearranged to accommodate him. The guilt was an ever-present shadow. He saw it in Andrew's hurried goodbyes each morning, Maria's polite but distant smiles, and the meals Linda, their well-meaning neighbor, brought when they were too busy to cook. "You're not wanted here," Linda had said one day, shaking her head as she placed a plate of stew on the table. "It's the same everywhere. Once we get old, our children think we're a burden." Her words struck a chord. They echoed thoughts Robert dared not voice aloud. Was he a burden? Was it true that he was no longer needed, no longer valued? On his birthday, the answer seemed painfully clear. Andrew and Maria had left early for work, offering only a brief happy birthday, Dad. As they walked out the door, Linda, ever punctual, brought a slice of cake later that afternoon. Robert ate it alone, staring at a photo of his late wife, Sarah, propped on the bedside table. "How did we end up here, Sarah?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "How did life become so empty?" Robert and Sarah's life had been full once, bursting with laughter, love, and shared dreams. Together, they had built a small but beautiful home in Charlotte. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Robert still remembered Sarah's laughter as she planted flowers in the garden or her joy in decorating the house for the holidays. Her warmth had transformed every corner of their home into a sanctuary. And when Andrew came into their lives, Sarah's son from her first marriage, Robert embraced him as his own. Robert's mind often drifted back to those days, but the memories were tainted by the fire that had claimed their home. One fateful evening, he had lit a candle to fight the darkness of a power outage and fallen asleep. By the time neighbors pulled him from the burning house, everything they had built together was gone. Sarah's belongings, family photographs, and the life they had so carefully nurtured had been reduced to ash. Andrew had insisted on bringing him to Dallas to recover. But Robert had left more than his home behind in Charlotte. He had left a piece of himself, a piece that he feared he would never get back. Life in Andrew and Maria's house was comfortable, yet it felt as though he was living in the margins of their story. Each passing day only deepened his resolve to free them of what he believed to be his burden. "I need you to take me to a nursing home," Robert said one evening, his tone firm and final. Andrew sighed, his exhaustion evident. "Not now, Dad. Let's talk about it later." "Later?" Robert snapped, his voice tinged with frustration. "You've been saying later for weeks. If you won't do it, I will." Andrew placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder, but the gesture felt hollow. "Please, Dad. Just give it time." Time. Robert had plenty of it, too much. In fact, each night, as he sat alone with Sarah's photo, he whispered apologies to her. Apologies for being the man who couldn't let go of the past and who had become a burden to their son. But everything changed one bright Saturday morning. Andrew walked into Robert's room with an unusual energy. He held a crisp white shirt and a neatly folded pair of slacks. "Pack your things, Dad," Andrew said, his voice steady but unreadable. "We're going on a trip." Maria followed with fresh towels and sheets. Her smile was warm, yet mysterious, as though she knew something Robert didn't. Robert's heart sank. This was it, he thought. They were finally taking him to the nursing home. His hands trembled as he clutched Sarah's photograph. His lifeline in moments like these. He packed his belongings with a solemn precision, placing the photo carefully on top of the neatly folded clothes. The car ride was quiet. Robert sat in the back seat, gripping his suitcase as if letting go would somehow make the inevitable harder to bear. Andrew drove, his expression unreadable, while Maria gazed out the window with a small, knowing smile. The city's skyscrapers soon gave way to the open countryside, the scenery blurring together as Robert's mind raced. The rolling hills and wildflowers reminded him of drives he used to take with Sarah, their laughter filling the car as they imagined growing old together. "We're almost there," Maria said, breaking the silence. "Where are we going?" Robert asked, his voice betraying a mix of fear and curiosity. "You'll see," Andrew replied cryptically, a faint smile playing on his lips. As the car slowed, Robert's stomach churned. He expected to see the grey facade of a nursing home. But what greeted him was beyond anything he could have imagined. The car came to a stop on a gravel driveway, crunching under the tires as Andrew turned off the engine. Robert hesitated, his breath caught in his chest. As Andrew stepped out and opened the back door for him, Robert's hands clutched the suitcase tighter. He braced himself for the sight of a sterile building surrounded by unfamiliar faces. But as he stepped out of the car, the world seemed to shift. Before him stood a house, not just any house, but his house. Robert blinked, his vision blurring with tears. The home he had lost to the fire in Charlotte stood there as if it had never been touched by flames. The white paint gleamed under the midday sun. The porch railings were sturdy and new, and the windows sparkled as though they were watching him, waiting for him to step inside. "What is this?" Robert stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Andrew stepped beside him, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "Welcome home, Dad," he said softly, his voice brimming with emotion. Home. The word hung in the air, almost surreal. Robert's knees buckled, and Andrew quickly caught him, steadying him before he fell. For a moment, Robert could do nothing but stare at the house, his mind struggling to comprehend what was in front of him. "This can't be," he murmured, shaking his head. "It is," Andrew replied with a smile. "Come inside." Robert's steps were unsteady as he made his way toward the porch, his fingers brushing against the smooth, freshly painted railing. Each step felt like a bridge between the pain of the past and the hope of the present. When Andrew opened the door, Robert hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The air inside was warm, carrying the faint scent of pine and varnish. Robert's eyes scanned the room, and his breath caught again. The interior was familiar, yet new. The layout mirrored the house he had once shared with Sarah, but every surface gleamed with care and restoration. The wooden floors shone. The walls were painted in soft, welcoming tones, and the furniture exuded the same cozy charm that Sarah had once cultivated with such love. Then he saw it, the photograph on the mantel. It was a picture of him and Sarah on their wedding day, their smiles radiant and full of hope for the life ahead. "How?" Robert choked out, his voice breaking. Andrew gestured for him to sit in an armchair near the fireplace. It was his old armchair, lovingly reupholstered with fabric that looked exactly like the one Sarah had chosen years ago. "We never planned to send you to a nursing home," Andrew began, his voice thick with emotion. "We knew how much this house meant to you. So, when the fire happened, we made it our mission to rebuild it." Maria stepped forward, placing a hand on Robert's shoulder. "We wanted it to be a surprise," she said with a warm smile. The neighbors helped too. Everyone wanted to give you back what you'd lost. Robert's chest heaved as he struggled to process their words. But the land, he began, his voice trembling. I signed the papers. I thought I sold it. Andrew shook his head, his smile growing. Those weren't sale papers, Dad. They were permits for construction. We needed your approval to start rebuilding. Every nail, every beam, it's all for you. Tears streamed down Robert's face as he buried his head in his hands. He had spent so many nights believing he was a burden, convinced that his family no longer cared. Yet here they were, standing before him, having poured their time and love into this home. Maria handed him a thick photo album. There's something else, she said gently. Robert opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photographs that had survived the fire, painstakingly restored. Pictures of Sarah in their garden, of Andrew as a child taking his first steps, and of family celebrations that had filled the house with joy. The pages smelled faintly of smoke, but the images were vivid, bursting with life and color. As he flipped through the album, Robert stopped at a photograph of Sarah holding a basket of fresh vegetables. Her smile radiated happiness, and for the first time in years, Robert felt a warmth in his chest that he thought had been extinguished forever. This, he whispered, his voice barely audible. This is more than I ever could have imagined. Andrew knelt beside him, his eyes glistening. You've done so much for me, Dad. For us. This is just our way of saying thank you. Before Robert could respond, a familiar sound reached his ears. A soft, gentle whinny echoed from outside, pulling him from his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat. Is that, he began, his voice trailing off. Andrew grinned. Come and see, he said, leading his father to the door. Robert followed Andrew to the porch, his heart pounding in his chest. As they stepped outside, the sight before him stopped him in his tracks. Tied to a freshly built post near the garden stood a horse, a beautiful chestnut stallion with a gleaming coat and a familiar gaze. Duke, Robert whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The horse turned its head toward him, letting out another soft whinny. It was as if Duke recognized him instantly, his ears perking up and his hooves shifting excitedly. Robert's breath hitched as he took a hesitant step forward, his hands trembling. His alive, Robert murmured, his voice cracking. Tears streamed down his face as he hurried down the steps as fast as his legs could carry him. He wrapped his arms around Duke's neck, burying his face in the horse's mane. I thought I'd lost you too. Maria joined Andrew on the porch, her face lit with a warm smile. We found him a few weeks after the fire, she explained. He'd wandered to the outskirts of town. The neighbors helped care for him until we could bring him back. Robert stood there for a long moment, his hands stroking Duke's mane as he took in the solid, familiar warmth of the horse. The memories of the life they had shared came flooding back, the long days in the garden, the rides through the countryside, and the quiet companionship Duke had offered during Robert's loneliest moments. As he turned back to Andrew and Maria, his voice was filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. You did all of this for me. Andrew stepped forward, his smile soft but steady. You've always been there for me, Dad. For us. This is just a small way to show you how much we care. Robert shook his head, overwhelmed. This isn't small, Andrew. This is everything. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Robert sat on the porch with Andrew and Maria. Duke grazed peacefully in the yard, his presence a comforting reminder of the past. The faint sounds of crickets filled the air, blending with the rustling leaves in the gentle breeze. For the first time in years, Robert felt at peace. His heart, once heavy with loss and loneliness, was now brimming with joy. The home he thought he'd lost forever had been returned to him, not just in bricks and wood, but in the love and dedication of his family. As they sat together, Robert finally broke the silence. I was wrong, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of months of doubt and guilt. I thought I was a burden. But you've shown me that I'm anything but. Andrew reached over and clasped his father's hand firmly. You're not a burden, Dad. You're our foundation. Robert looked at his son, then at the house, and finally at Duke grazing peacefully in the yard. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it. Later that evening, after Andrew and Maria had returned to their home in Dallas, Robert stood alone in the living room. He let his gaze wander from one corner to the next, taking in every detail of the house that had been lovingly rebuilt. Each piece of furniture, each photograph on the walls, and each familiar scent in the air spoke of love, effort, and family. On the mantel, his favorite photo of Sarah smiled back at him, as if to say, "You're home." Robert clutched the thick photo album Andrew had given him earlier, flipping through its pages once more. With each image, he felt closer to Sarah, to the life they had shared, and to the love that had endured despite everything. As he prepared for bed, Robert opened his suitcase to unpack. At the bottom, he found an envelope addressed to Andrew, a letter he had written weeks ago in his darkest moment. In it, he had apologized for being a burden and begged for forgiveness for what he thought was his failure as a father. Robert held the envelope for a long moment before tearing it into pieces. No more doubts, he said softly to himself. Andrew has shown me that love doesn't count burdens, it only counts blessings. Before turning in for the night, Robert stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of wildflowers. Duke looked up as he approached, his ears twitching at the sound of Robert's footsteps. "We're home, Duke," Robert said with a smile, running his hand along the horse's mane. "And it's better than I could have ever imagined." The stars above twinkled brightly, their light reflected in the windows of the house. As Robert stood there, soaking in the quiet peace of the night, he realized something profound. He hadn't just been given back his home, he had been reminded of the enduring power of love, the strength of family, and the unshakable bonds that time and hardship could never break. As Robert sat on his newly rebuilt porch, the cool night breeze carried with it the gentle scent of wildflowers and the soft rustling of leaves. Duke grazed peacefully nearby, his presence a comforting echo of the past. Inside, the home Robert thought he had lost forever now stood as a testament to love, dedication, and the unbreakable bonds of family. For the first time in years, Robert felt whole. He no longer saw himself as a burden but as the foundation of a family that cherished him deeply. With every moment spent in this house, he was reminded that love, true, unconditional love, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. As the stars twinkled above, Robert whispered, "Thank you," his heart full of gratitude. If you enjoyed this touching story, be sure to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartwarming tales.